Today's topic is the interwar years, the period of 1920 to 1939 between the two world wars. We have competing worldviews. The first is that of world peace and the second of world domination. Specifically, we'll look at the Gandhian movement in India as an example of independence movements, but also a blueprint for nonviolent strategies. Then we will explore Stalinist Russia and fascism in Italy. In the last unit, we discussed the Treaty of Versailles and its goal to prevent future wars. Today, we're going to delve a little deeper to discuss what went wrong. This map shows the new countries and their borders as per the treaty and also shows which country they once were a part of. Although the creation of these new boundaries made every effort to keep ethnic groups together, there was still a large number of people who would be displaced. For example, East Prussia, part of Germany, is cut off by Corridor, which was now part of Poland. Likewise, there were many Germans in the westernmost part of Czechoslovakia. Europe also suffered greatly from post-war inflation and high unemployment rates. Even with women being forced to return to work inside the home, there just weren't enough jobs for all the men. Imperialism was still a major issue as European powers claimed they needed the colonies to recover from the war. One such place where imperialism was challenged was none other than the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. World War I had shocked many Asians and Africans. They no longer believed in the self-proclaimed superiority of the Europeans. World War I showed them to be no more, quote, civilized than any other culture who came before. All their amazing technology was used to blow themselves to pieces. The Indian National Congress was the largest group of Indians who were calling for the end to British rule. They were mostly Western educated, from higher castes in the Hindu religion or Indian society, and prominent members of the Muslim population. They didn't have the mass appeal that the later Gandhian movement would, but they still had large enough numbers to attempt protest and be noticed by the press. In 1918, one such protest occurred in Amritsar. The Indian National Congress was protesting the lack of trial by jury. Over 100,000 protesters demonstrated nonviolently. The British police fired on the crowd, killing 379 and wounding 1,200 people. The massacre was reported on by the press all over the world. Britain, who had always prided themselves on being just and fair rulers, were disgraced. It led to the passage of the India Act, in which voting rights were expanded to women and middle caste Indians were allowed to hold local elections and hold office. This gave them some rights, but certainly was not enough. Many abuses of human rights continued, and India was still a British colony. Gandhi was a Hindu of an upper caste. This allowed him to be educated in Western schools. He earned his law degree in London. The picture on the left of the screen shows him a very assimilated Gandhi, not the image we are familiar with on the right of the screen. Upon earning his license to practice law, he goes to South Africa to provide legal representation for the 100,000 or so Indians living in South Africa at the time. It is there that he starts developing his nonviolent tactics. For example, he stages a rally in which Indians burn their identification cards. These ID cards were symbols of oppression as they were a means for the colonial government to control them. Any Indian who was in, quote, white areas without his or her ID could be and often was arrested. This demonstration caught the attention of the international press and the INC, who convinced him to come home to use his methods for Swaraj or self-rule. Over the next 25 years, he would do just that. Please pause this lecture and view the film, India Defying the Crown, which explores the 1930 Great Salt March led by Gandhi. While the Gandhian movement was nonviolent, it was part of a larger movement of anti-imperialism that threatened world peace. Not all anti-colonial movements were nonviolent. There were also many challenges within Europe to world peace. One such threat came to Spain and Portugal as communist revolutions were attempted but unsuccessful in both countries. Also, in Germany's Weimar Republic, Parliamentary democracy made many Germans unhappy with their government when they failed to solve the economic recession in Germany. In 1923, the National Socialist Party attempted to overthrow the government and failed. Many new Eastern European countries also struggled with ineffective democratic governments, and some looked to communism to solve their problems. Again, the Communist Party did not overthrow these governments, but the party's membership grew exponentially. Even France's government was unstable. It changed hands 6 times between 1925 and 1926. Needless to say, any government can't make policies to provide solutions to a country's problems when it is not in power longer than 2 months. Domestic problems threatened world peace if they resulted in revolution and civil war. There were also challenges to world peace between European countries and their neighbors, and particularly in 1923 between France and Germany. Violence was a potential issue when German citizens used nonviolent protests to show frustration of the French troops occupying the Ruhr Valley. Although it ended relatively peacefully, it did gain sympathy for Germany internationally. The Washington Naval Conference that took place between 1921 and 1922 was an effort to keep peace by international disarmament. When the Treaty of Versailles was enacted, the Central Powers, losing side of the Great War, were forced to disarm. But if we were achieving world peace, then the victors, the Allies, would also disarm. Therefore, the conference had good intentions, but unforeseeable negative consequences. The ratio of 55311 for every ship Britain and the United States had, Japan would have 3, Italy and France 1, only angered Japan and Italy, who believed they should be allowed to have as many ships as Britain and the United States. The Locarno Treaties were a series of treaties starting in 1925 made by the League of Nations. Most had to do with border disputes in Europe and were seen as a success as they had solved their problems diplomatically. Out of the Locarno Treaties came the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. 64 nations renounced war as a means of solving their disputes. They resolved only to go to war in self-defense. 64 might not seem like a large number, but remember the imperialists voted on behalf of their colonies too. It was seen as an achievement of world peace and represented a hopeful moment in world history. Speaking of the League of Nations, these so-called successes of the 1920s gave them a false sense of security. When they failed in major disputes in the 1930s, there was little they could do to enforce their decisions. Because the League of Nations structure was one country, one vote, and majority rules, it only worked if the country that did not get their way abided by the decision. They had no military branch to enforce their decisions if the aggrieved party decided not to abide by their decision, as Italy, Japan, and Germany would do. Immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, Russia became embroiled in a civil war, which lasted to 1922. Therefore, the Soviets were not a major threat to world peace in the early 1920s. They did, however, have many internal struggles. Stalin came to power shortly after Lenin's death in 1924, in which Trotsky, the heir apparent, was accused by Stalin as a counter-revolutionary and forced to flee the Soviet Union. He lived for 16 years in many places in the world, but in 1940, on orders from Stalin, he was killed in Mexico. Stalin's rule was ruthless and absolute. He created a police state complete with a secret police ready to arrest, torture, or kill those who opposed him. He also used the Comintern, short for Communist International, to attempt to encourage communist revolutions in other countries. He attempted to improve the Soviet economy by collectivization in the agricultural sector and 5-year plans in the industrial sector. Collectivization is the term in which landowners had to give up ownership of their land to the state, quote, in the name of the people. Multiple people will grow and harvest foodstuffs to be distributed by the government to the people. The government would make sure everyone worked and everyone received the same amount of food. The 5-year plans called for rapid industrialization in order to make the Soviet Union an economic powerhouse that other countries depended on. The government controlled the media and education systems. Stalin's message was one of anti-capitalism and pro-Stalinism. The 1930s were wrought with peril as 5 million people would eventually be arrested, sentenced to torture in a series of prisons called the Gulag, or executed, partly to give the appearance of due process and partly to scare people into submission. The show trials were held. Pause the lecture and watch the footage of Nikolai Bukharin's trial in 1938. What elements of due process are missing? Fascist Italy was not much different than Stalinist Russia. Both were totalitarian regimes, although they were diametrically opposed politically. Mussolini was born in 1883 in northern Italy. He was from a middle-class family and, by all accounts, a bully. He got kicked out of school for stabbing a classmate. His mother was a teacher and his father an editor of the socialist newspaper. Mussolini eventually became an editor of the leading socialist newspaper, Avanti. When in 1915 they fired him for supporting Italian entry into the war, he formed his own newspaper and the Fascist Party. For the first 4 years, fascism as a political party is slightly schizophrenic. It is extremely nationalistic, but also calls for labor rights and other socialist ideas. Some historians don't include this in dating fascism and start with 1919, when the platform changed. Mussolini had trouble gaining support in the first 4 years. People who were supportive of his nationalism, the upper and middle classes, were not supportive of labor rights. The people supportive of labor rights already had the Socialist Party. So after the end of World War I, Mussolini decides to abandon his socialist roots and propagate an anti-communist platform. He would be the sane alternative to the Red Menace. This earned him support among a cross-section of Italians who feared communist revolution. It also won him favor with the Catholic Church. Fascism believes in the power of the state above all else, a strong sense of Italian nationalism. Mussolini would, quote, restore the power and glory of Rome, end quote, and a strong military to do so. The military would also provide jobs for people, lessening some of Italy's economic problems. In 1922, Mussolini and his black shirts marched on Rome calling for a new prime minister. When the king, Victor Emmanuel III, sees this, he asks Mussolini to form a government. Over the next decade, Mussolini will slowly erode the constitution and consolidate his power. Pause the lecture and follow the link to the clip. Specifically, one way he uses the Catholic Church to gain support of the majority of Italians. 99% of Italy was Roman Catholic. In 1929, he signs a concordat with the Pope, recognizing the sovereignty of his rule. He also allows Roman Catholicism to be the state religion. In return, the Pope mostly stays out of state affairs. Beginning in 1929 and spanning much of the 1930s, the world experienced the Great Depression, a monumental downturn in the global economy that caused severe unemployment, homelessness, and a collapse of international trade. It began with a major correction in the U.S. stock market known as the crash, and the subsequent panic led to millions of investors being wiped out. This catastrophic event led to desperate measures being taken in many places in the world. It is important to note that in the U.S., there was a psychological factor that hurt us as well. The U.S. supposedly had a great economy in the 1920s, so the crash and panic took us by surprise. This was different in Europe, where they had been suffering economically since the end of the Great War. Nevertheless, FDR's first inaugural address in 1933 gave hope to many Americans when he said, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," end quote. His policies, known as the New Deal, did not end the Great Depression, but he did restore the belief that things would get better. The impact of the Great Depression on Japan was much the same as elsewhere: high unemployment, homelessness, hopelessness. As Europe and the United States look inward, global markets weakened. Japan could sell fewer exports to the US and Europe, so they attempted to take their natural resources by force to improve their unfavorable balance of trade. In 1931, what's known as the Pacific War in Japan began when Japan invaded Manchuria. China, following the Mukden incident. The Japanese bombed railroad tracks and blamed the communists. At the time, the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT were in a civil war for control of China. Therefore, it was believable that the Chinese Communist Party had done it. Japan uses this as a pretext to invade, claiming that the Chinese government needs Japan to restore order. The League of Nations protests, but Japan drops its membership in the League. Little more is done because, although the US and Europe are not pleased with Japan's interfering with Chinese sovereignty, they are more focused on their own problems. Also, if Japan is stopping the communists from coming to power in China, then so be it. It was a shrewd move on Japan's part. The Pacific War continues, and in 1937 it escalates when Japan invaded the rest of China at the Marco Polo Bridge. The KMT and Chiang Kai-shek, China's leader, had been doing little to stop the Japanese as he was consumed with wiping out the Chinese Communist Party. In 1936, just prior to the Japanese invasion, the CCP and the KMT agreed to stop fighting each other to form a united front against Japan. When an estimated 50,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians are raped and murdered at the city of Nanking in 1938 by Japanese troops, the U.S. organized aid to the Chinese and placed an embargo on Japan on the sale of planes. Some trade continued until the summer of 1941. In summary, the 2 decades between the 2 world wars were plagued by 2 competing worldviews, one of world peace, one of world domination. Next lecture will explore Hitler's rise to power in World War II.